Welcome EES 105 Global Environment class to our field trip to the Red Lake. This is a historic anthracite coal mining site that was heavily mined in the early 1900s for anthracite coal. This was during the era where coal was king in Luzerne County and surrounding counties. Coal has been an important energy resource for the United States for several hundred years, and anthracite coal from northeastern Pennsylvania helped fuel the Industrial Revolution in Pennsylvania, the steel industry as well in Pennsylvania, and for the entire United States. So we have been a critical energy resource for a long time. But economically, locally, unfortunately, in the mid-1900s, the anthracite coal mining industry really came to almost an end. We still have a little bit of anthracite coal mining in the region, but there was a large disaster in the mines where the underground mines were flooded in what's locally known as the Knox Mine disaster. We'll talk about that at another time. And with that event, the mining in the region really came to an end. This site wasn't directly impacted by the Knox Mine disaster because it was a surface mine, it wasn't an underground mine, but it did impact the site in the sense that the region lost a lot of jobs, and ultimately this site was closed as well. So this was a big open pit where the overlying rock was stripped off and piled in what is now woods in the surrounding area. So we can't see it here because of all the vegetation today, but there are large mounds of waste rock and refuse in the woods. And then they mined the coal out of this deep pit, which during the mining operations, they had to continuously pump water out of the bottom of the pit because the groundwater was seeping into the bottom. So obviously when the mining came to an end, the pumps were shut off, and the strip mine filled up with water. And here it is still today. So the water obviously is stained this incredibly red color. And the reason why it's red is because in the rocks that contain the coal, there's also a mineral known as pyrite. And that mineral contains iron and sulfur. And when the pyrite is exposed to rainwater or groundwater and oxygen, it chemically reacts, and that iron is released into solution, and it stains the water this dark red color. And then we also have a problem with the sulfur that's found in the pyrite mineral. That sulfur will also react with oxygen and water and form sulfuric acid. So not only is this water stained iron, red with iron, but it also has a very low pH, which between those two conditions is quite toxic to wildlife and even plant life. Although we see a lot of vegetation around the perimeter of the Red Lake, it is still quite toxic to a lot of different species. So, off in the far distance, you'll see those reed-like plants. Those are called cattails, and those are highly adaptive to these acidic conditions. But in the water itself, you will not find, much aquatic life, whether it's small, micro, or macro invertebrates, fish, larger species. It's largely a dead ecosystem in the lake itself. And realizing lake is, really a misnomer. Also, I know the wind is kind of blowing right now, and it's a little bit difficult to see, but as you're watching the video, you might see ripples, not from the wind blowing, but it looks like if any of you guys, fish, you might see like these ripples spreading out, and a lot of times, fishermen will look for that because that is fish catching mosquitoes and other bugs that are close to the surface of the water. So I always ask students when we see these ripple marks, and when they happen, I'll try and point them out. Oh, do you think that's fish in the water? It's actually not, because like I said, there's, next to no life in this water body. But what it is methane gas. And we will have talked about, methane gas being associated with coal deposits in lecture. And that's what we're seeing here, is that there is also methane gas still trapped down in the bedrock in the layers where there's still coal in the ground. We didn't get it all out. And that methane is moving up through the bedrock into the bottom of the old strip mine, and then migrating through the water column and then into the atmosphere. And we see these little bubbles popping out into the atmosphere on the surface of the water here. So that's another pollutant in the area. Is not just the iron, which is obviously impacting the water, but it's also impacting our nearby streams, the sulfur that is forming sulfuric acid, and then also this methane issue. And then on top of that, it's unfortunately been a culture in our region with these mine lands. There's thousands and thousands of mine lands in Luzerne County and surrounding counties that have been abandoned for 40, 50, 60, even 70 years in some cases. And unfortunately, we have this culture that it's okay to illegally dump trash in these kind of areas. And if we spin the camera around, we can take a picture of some garbage right here. Obviously, there have been some folks that have been out here partying. And many times when I've brought students down here, we'll see refuse. There's some gun shells. They like to target shoot down here. But there's a lot worse dumping. I mean, this is bad enough, but oftentimes we have very significant illegal dumping from, you name it, from couches to old cars to drug paraphernalia, plastic mattresses, you name it, everything including the kitchen sink. So on top of the environmental issues from the historic mining, we also have current illegal dumping going on. So it's a real travesty for our region to continue to deal with these historic mine lands. Now this parcel is owned by an old mining family, and then there are surrounding lands. If we look up on the hillside here into the woods, the mining continued on up the hill, and those lands are actually owned by a different organization. There was a big coal company in the area that was called Blue Coal, and they owned at the height about 17,000 acres. And then their company went bankrupt. And probably close to about 20 years now, a nonprofit organization was formed to clean up those 17,000 acres. And out of the 17,000, close to 10,000 acres were heavily impacted by historic mining activities. So, there's a lot of surface contamination of both the soil and the water. And when the organization was founded, they had very lofty goals where they thought they could get these 10,000 acres cleaned up in, about 5 years or so. And, as I said, it's been about 20 years now that the organization has been active, and they've only cleaned up to date around 3,000 acres. So what do they do with this land? They fill in the pits. They put in treatment systems to deal with contaminated surface and groundwater. And then they try and redevelop that land. And we've had quite a few parcels in the Wyoming Valley, some parcels not too far from campus, where they used to be old anthracite coal mining lands, and now there are warehouses on top of them, commercial buildings. It's largely been a lot of industrial and commercial redevelopment of these historic mine lands. But then they also convert some of that land back into open space. So we've had several recreation parks with baseball fields and football fields and hockey fields developed. And then we've also had some parcels that have been allowed to become more wild, and we have, like natural hiking trails through the woods. So it's been a variety of different land uses for this reclaimed mine land, which is really good for the local economy because, when we have land like this, we don't have businesses on them contributing to property taxes, bringing in revenue to the community. So it's a real detriment to many towns and cities and counties, especially in northeastern Pennsylvania, and they have similar issues in western Pennsylvania with the mining of bituminous coal, a little bit different type of coal, where we have still this legacy of impacts from the old mining industry that are impacting the local economies still today. So it takes a lot of money and a lot of work to get this land cleaned up and reused. And Earth Conservancy is the entity that has been managing these blue coal lands, And, you know, they've done, you know, their best job, a great job, some would say a very poor job, because here we are still 20 years later and they still have a lot of land to clean up. But it's tough to get the money from grants and other types of resources to reclaim this type of mine land. So, you know, there was a recognition after much of the mining industry collapsed across the country, not just here in northeastern Pennsylvania, that, you know, the companies that mined the land, made their fortunes, and then eventually went bankrupt, left a mess to, you know, the local economies when their business was long gone. So there was a piece of legislation that was passed in 1977, the Surface Mining Act, that now requires mining companies, coal mining companies, to basically buy an insurance policy. We call it a bond, where they have to set aside a certain amount of money so that if their company does go bankrupt, that there's a pot of money that's available for local communities, local government, state government, to then seize and use to clean up the land, so that we're not left with the same problem that happened here, you know, 50, 60, 70 years ago. And they're also required, as they're mining, to do reclamation. So hopefully, you know, if there is an unfortunate circumstance and they do go bankrupt, there isn't a large amount of land that's still left to be reclaimed, because they should have been reclaiming the areas as they finish mining them. That certainly wasn't done in the early 1900s through, you know, the mid-1900s in our region related to the anthracite coal mining legacy. So, you know, part of your assignment will be to talk about what are the different environmental impacts, and then really make that connection, and we make that connection all through this course, or at least I hope to, of realizing that, you know, we're focusing on environmental issues, but there are these very strong interconnections with different parts of, you know, our society. You know, there's still, after all of these years, you know, economic repercussions, quality of life repercussions to citizens today. You know, and there's also health consequences. You know, I haven't even touched on yet here today the health impacts. You know, this water from the Red Lake drains into Newport Creek, which drains into the Susquehanna River. I don't know about you guys, but looking at this water, I sure as heck wouldn't be comfortable drinking it. Well, guess what? This water drains into the Susquehanna River, which is a drinking water source for the town of Danville just downstream. And many other communities along the Susquehanna River pull their drinking water out of the river. Of course, it's treated in a drinking water treatment plant, which costs a lot of money to maintain and operate. So there's a cost associated with having to remove these pollutants to protect human health for communities downstream. Well, you know, the folks in Danville and other communities downstream, they're not too happy that we're still polluting the Susquehanna River and causing them to spend more money to treat the water before they can use it to drink. So again, it shows this interconnectedness of our communities.